Hi, and welcome back to our study group discussion of Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. We're doing the series on the history of classical Indian philosophy, discussing episodes 20 to 22. And I'm Nerdalliun Plebz, and with me today is Rogério Marques and Pong. How's it, guys? Welcome back.
Nice to be back.
Always great to do this.
So it turns out that we will be focusing today on Mimamsa, looking at it, and closing Mimamsa as we've started from the previous session. And so today we will close Mimamsa, and in the next session we will be able to start Vedanta, which is the twin school, as it were, of Mimamsa.
Okay. Yeah, we discussed a little bit of Mimamsa last time, but sort of just briefly at the end ran through some stuff. So we're going to have a more slowly paced run through some of that same material and some more material to add to that, I believe.
Okay, so let's go. We will be discussing their views on ritual, as in ritual sacrifice, as explained or as described in the Vedas, their take on knowledge or epistemology, and also language. So there's the centrality of ritual sacrifice in Brahmanical culture as a means to propitiate gods. Although we will see, Mimamsa really don't go about talking about supernatural things like the gods. They are much more focused on the concreteness of either empiricism or actually what is prescribed in the Vedanta, as in the recipes, as it were, of the sacrifice. Also, the proper rituals are the key to high status of Brahmin priests. Lay persons from the lower classes to the upper ones would be reliant on Brahmin priests to perform the rituals. And they could be from humble offerings to the year-long horse ritual performed by kings. Very expensive ritual. And of course, people, since ritual was and still is an essential part in this culture, people want to know that they are performing the ritual correctly. And so there has been also a dispute between the Brahmanical traditions and its critics along several points in the description of the rituals. So there's this concept of Shruti, what is heard, in reference to the reverence and authoritativeness of the Vedas. It's like the Vedas always were, just as language always were, according to the Mimamsa and Vedanta schools. And so Vedic adherents consider the Vedas a Shruti, a source of knowledge upon the duties laid upon humanity, about the duties laid upon humanity. And then, so the Vedas cannot command assent because they suffer from the following epistemology defects: falsity, inconsistency, and repetition, as we've exposed in the previous session. So a critique summed up by one of the schools, actually the Nyaya Sutra. And then, so there are rules, of course, of rational, trustworthy discourse. And supposedly the Vedas violate these rules. An adequate account would need to fit in empirical reality, be consistent, and be succinct. And then, so to address these different critiques, so the promises of the rituals might not always be fulfilled, and so the rituals would perhaps promise tangible things, like for people who want wealth, to boil gold coins and offer them as a sacrifice. and so there's a defense, possible defense. So admittedly, rituals sometimes fail, but that is always because of faulty execution by the sacrificer, not a defect in the rules governing the ritual. All the more showing the importance of there being someone to really precisely and accurately describe how the rituals should be enacted, building upon what the Vedas have. And the Vedas, as I've mentioned, don't go into so much detail as people would want. So there's this quote from one of the Upanishads: "One who desires heaven should perform the fire ritual." This was one of the shifts of focus that we see represented in the Mimamsa school. They shift from talking about rituals to obtain tangible goods to wishing heaven as a default, basically, especially when Vedanta doesn't, the Vedic texts don't describe an outcome of the ritual. So a shift of focus from physical material to spiritual goods, which might not be enough. Also, the critique of Vedas being inconsistent, the defense would be, so they are seemingly consistent, but they apply to different situations, such as this critique of, well, if after sunrise you perform the sacrifice, it goes to the dogs, but also there's this idea that, well, if you intended to practice the ritual after sunrise, then it doesn't go to the dogs. And then, well, the Vedas seem to ramble a lot and repeat stuff, and the critiques would suppose it's being akin to how a drunkard would express themselves, but there's this defense that repetition is sometimes useful. Also, there's this critique of Vedic ritual from schools, heterodox schools that are more pacifists, more focused on nonviolence, like the Buddhists, criticizing the Vedas for inciting unnecessary violence against beings. Additionally, as I've mentioned, detail is often insufficient, and so the Mimamsa school hopes to address these critiques, these problems, by systematizing the Vedic injunctions or the steps needed to properly perform the rituals, to understand how to proceed in the face of incomplete information. So their mission to expound and interpret the Veda in hopes of establishing consistent ritual conduct. And so they use several tools, methods to solve lack of precision and description of rituals. Oftentimes, a ritual is describing for a certain situation, and the Mimamsa school, in order to allow for people to perform a similar ritual for a different situation, they perform what is called atidesa, or transference of details, or sometimes some details they consider no longer relevant for the transfer, and so they perform bada, or annulment of or exclusion of details, or some details need to change for the new situation. I'm reminded that Peter Adamson used the example of contemporary example of switching a car battery for a person who is experienced in switching car batteries in other cars, but for a new car. And so they have an understanding, a general understanding of switching car batteries that they can adapt to the new model, vehicle. And also they often use model in Mimamsa, they use practice siaga, model sacrifice, to be used in different situations. with this alteration of details according to their reasoning. So this is a gist of how they perform the adaptation of rituals. Also, they perform this system of reasoning, which is if the ritual seems nice in several contexts and is correct in several contexts, then in a new context with reasonably adapted details, it will also function. And this is analogized to the visual metaphor of if someone is cooking rice, they want to check if the rice is cooked, and the single grain is verified as cooked and by tasting. And so the conclusion is the entire rice could be considered probably cooked. So this also carries over to not just specific rituals for the Brahmanic tradition, but also to ethical reasoning in general, which is philosophically interesting. So if we know the right thing to do in a situation and another situation where some details change, but it's overall very similar, then chances are the lesson that we learned and applied in a previous similar situation will also be useful for the new situation. Then there's this quote from the Mimamsa Sutra: Dharma depends upon the Veda, so whatever is not Veda is not to be trusted. And so as concerning rituals, they really are sticklers for the Veda, and they try to use as much from the Veda as possible, only using these techniques that I've described previously, the annulment, adaptation, transference, if needed, if there are not sufficient details. So this is the part where we start to talk about epistemology a bit. So I'm tagging out and wondering if you guys would like to add anything or comment on what I was presenting just now.
Yeah, I think I've got a couple of comments. I imagine Graham might also have. So that covers mostly, or let's say like a brief summary of what Peter Adamson discussed in episode 20. So yeah, there's a little bit about the skepticism or skeptic arguments and critiques raised against Vedas, was just setting context for like the kind of intellectual milieu Mimamsa was operating in. But I think for that chapter, he spent maybe a little, but a lot of time on Niyaya Sutra that has very little to do with Mimamsa Sutra. In fact, just to set context, maybe more than he had to. I actually thought he might have put some of that material at the end of the previous chapter that was about skepticism. But okay, be that as it may, about Mimamsa Sutra, something that I kind of got by reading like the Wikipedia page on Mimamsa Sutra is just some of the timelines for when the key texts were composed. And I'm going from memory now, so I may get it a little wrong, but even just a rough timeline is already helpful for me, at least. So it's interesting to me. So the Mimamsa Sutra, I think the dates are uncertain, but if I remember correctly, it was between 400 and 200 BCE that the dates are estimated. The original Mimamsa Sutra is lost. There's no existing copy of the Mimamsa Sutra. The copy that, or the writing that survives, is a Bhāsya, which is contains the sutra and also commentary on it, written by, what is it, Shaba, someone like that.
Shabhava, I think it's the name. Shabhava.
So I probably should have taken
Shabara, actually. Yeah.
Shabara. I probably should have taken notes. That was written, if I remember correctly, around the time of Christ, maybe 100 AD or CE. And then there was an extensive commentary that became very important in maybe one of the most influential branches of the Mimamsa school or tradition, because they had several branches the tradition went into. was written by Kumarili, if I'm saying that right, or Kumirila, something along those lines, but also around 700 BCE. And so the Bhashya that has the sutra and immediate commentary on the sutra in it is from around the time of Christ, and then there was a major commentary on that Bhashya around the time of Muhammad. So give or take roughly, just to have an idea from when these things are from. So that was one thing I wanted to add, just a rough timeline. And then some other comments about how they systematize the ritual injunctions of the Vedas, because, and this was something noted by Eliza Freshy. Like in the Vedas themselves, the rituals aren't laid out in a neat systematic form. They're presented as parts of stories and digressions and debates and other kinds of discussions. And so the Mimamsas were trying to bring it together, and also to solve this really tricky problem that, say, if the Nyaya school wants to say, well, if the rituals fail, it's because you did them improperly, then it becomes really important to know how to do them properly. And sometimes the Vedas are unclear, so they had like a whole system for interpreting how to interpret what the Vedas mean you should be doing, how you should be doing the ritual. And I guess that's why if you read, like, the Mimamsa school had to do with the hermeneutics of the Vedas, it was mainly how to interpret what the Vedas said so that you get to an explicit recipe for how to do your rituals and how to conduct yourself properly. And then something that stood out to me is they really link the performance of ritual with desires. And so they don't take this tact where they say, well, whatever you desire, you have a duty to be good. They say, no, if you have certain desires, there are certain rituals that go with those desires, and you can come to know what rituals go with which desires from the Vedas, and the Vedas are the foundational authority for how to know that. And you wouldn't be able to discover those kinds of laws by making any kinds of plain sense perceptions. Like, there's nothing you could just observe. They didn't consider experiments as a method, but if you just look around at objects, there are no objects that'll tell you what ritual to perform. And so they say, like, the only way you can find out what rituals to perform is by reading the Vedas. And we'll get into that, I guess, in the next slides about epistemology, like why they were really keen to justify the authority and the trustworthiness of the Vedas. But yeah, linking Dharma explicitly and exclusively to desire is something that Peter Adamson also says. It seems like they're making, like, Dharma contingent on human desires, and he gives an alternative interpretation where he says, like, no, actually, the Vedas are primary and the rituals are primary, and human desires are just like a vehicle for the rituals to operate in. So human desires are the occasion for the ritual. The main event is the ritual, and the human is kind of incidental. There will be more humans that'll have similar desires, and that'll be new occasions for the ritual. But it's the rituals and the Dharma is eternal, and people come and go. So that was fairly interesting to me, and like a noteworthy thing. And they also, I don't know how much is lost in translation, but at least from listening to Peter Adamson's discussion of it, it seems they very explicitly link the desire for heaven with happiness, and at least in the Mimamsa school, like a very naturalistic, imperialistic kind of happiness, so like in this lifetime happiness. And they skew teaching liberation. I think some of the later commentaries, I forget who it was, maybe Kumarili or one of the other commentators, or maybe I'm just misremembering, basically said that moksha is impossible. So they had a critique that pursuing liberation from the cycle of samsara or whatever isn't a goal worth pursuing. What you want is happiness in this life, and you will inevitably be reborn, and no point worrying about that. If you do your duties right, you will be reborn in a more favorable state, and that's the best you can hope for. But escape is impossible. And let's see what other notes about the rituals. Oh, I think what also was noteworthy was that in principle, the lower classes and women could also participate in rituals. So if women had the desire, they would in principle be able to do the same ritual sacrifices and for the same reason and get the same results. And Eliza Freshy just said it just so happened that they weren't allowed to own property, so they wouldn't have the means to perform the rituals. But if they had owned properties, then there wouldn't be any problem with them performing the rituals, lower classes or women. So yeah, that was also quite interesting and noteworthy, I think. Yeah, I'll get to like the really interesting empiricism and stuff. Really relates to the epistemology more than just their take on ritual. So those are my comments on the Mimamsa School's stuff on ritual. Graham, any thoughts?
Oh, definitely. I was going to say the first one that jumps out to me is that they take almost a scientific approach to the ritual, not necessarily where it comes from, but it's like, the ritual is like performing an experiment, and they know what the result should be, and if it doesn't come out with that result, clearly something was wrong in either the ingredients or the procedure that was invoked. And it seems like they're trying to also establish the ritual as like a bridge between the spiritual realm and this realm, where it's like you're doing it for both reasons in this world and in the spiritual world, and it gets that connection between the two. And I was going to say, in the West, that whole grain of rights approach, that would be considered a logical fallacy of arguing from the particular to the universal. I think that's worth noting, and I think that's very, definitely symbolic and indicative of some of the differences between the East and the West. And the last one is I find it fascinating that they end up with all these different levels of interpretation cooked into their scriptures, where you have the original scripture, then you have the first guy's commentary on that scripture, then you have the second guy's commentary on the first guy's commentary on the scripture. And it's the, you have all those different, reflections, refractions of meaning between the guys. It's, once you get to that point, it's almost impossible to be certain what that actual original meaning of the scripture was. But you can definitely come up with at least an interpretation that should work for you based off of the two guys' work. Tagging on that.
Thanks. You both shared really relevant points in complement, for sure. I thought it's also really telling that the Brahmins are the same guys who have Mimamsa school that tells us desire is inextricably linked with rituals in a way that desires further or just furnishing the occasion for the ritual sacrifices, which ends up benefiting the Brahmin caste because part of these sacrifices go to them, such as in the example of boiling gold coins. So who ends up getting the boiled gold coins? So the ritual actually results for someone with some level of reliability without any supernatural things. It's just not necessarily for the non-Brahmin lay person that goes to the sacrificial pyre, utters the mantras, and performs the steps according to the prescriptions that the Brahmins were instructing them. Also, this link between human desires and people have desires by default through sheer evolutionary baggage, evolutionary psychological baggage, and also if it's further ingrained in the culture, even more so. And it was really clearly ingrained in the culture for people to, if they want more sons, they will express their desire for more sons in the form of rituals. And so since this desire link with ritual, with the benefit of the Brahmin caste systematically, was apparently prevalent in the historical context. Maybe it also in part explains why the heterodox schools often had people like the Buddhists and Jains, which were known for critiquing having desires in the first place. So it kind of sheds light into how the skeptics or critiques of this position held by Mimamsa, Nyaya, Vedanta, and other schools that were considered orthodox, how they actually maybe even ended up giving source for criticism for these heterodox schools. Okay, so moving on, perhaps. So now,
yeah,
go ahead, Nerdalliun, go ahead.
Yeah, there's like just one little thread of thought I was thinking about, just generally about sacrifice in societies and early religions. I think there's a connection with ritual sacrifice and early taxation systems that maybe made sacrifice before the taxation system got separated from it. Much more functional than religious, like just the economic affair where people people who did some farming, who did some hunts or whatever, would share some of their crop or their resources with the community, and that could get redistributed, so that there could be specialists who were paid or kept, who didn't spend a lot of time getting food. But as maybe society got more complex, that whole taxation system and compensating specialists for their work became disentangled from the more religious ceremonies, and then it maybe made less sense later on in history than it did initially. And another aspect of sacrifice, one that psychologists still use, is when you can't talk to an animal, you can reasonably well infer how much they like or dislike or how much they want something by observing how much they're willing to sacrifice for it. And this is also something that is mentioned in at least some religious scriptures relating to sacrifice, that you sort of show sincerity of care and of investment and of concern by being willing to sacrifice. And so I think there's some of that, and to the degree that people get what they want by cooperating with other people, if there is a social system of specific sacrificial rituals linked to specific desires, there may be some social function in actually letting the community know what your needs and desires are through doing the sacrifices. So without having to tell everyone, hey, I want children, which may be embarrassing, you go to the priest and you say, I want children. They say, well, there's this sacrifice you want to do, and these people should be involved and those people shouldn't be involved, and like that's the proper way to do it. And then the people who might be reasonably informed that you want a son get informed, and maybe an arranged marriage happen fortuitously not long after that, and that kind of thing. I'm sort of imagining a little bit how that might function, where some of those sacrifices may make some kind of sense. I'm pretty sure like mixed in there's some superstitious stuff where you're just kind of boiling gold in a pot and giving it to the priest, which may like superstition mixed in with greed among the priests or whatever. So I don't think all the sacrifices were functional, but I imagine a decent enough portion of it was quite functional in a fairly straightforward, commonsensical way for the traditions to sort of take root in the first place. And then they got elaborated in ways over time that not all of the ways made sense, but maybe they weren't so bad that they didn't get rooted out, with the exception of sort of gratuitous violence against animals, which did eventually fall out of favor because most people found that distasteful. I think in previous episodes I kind of mentioned that Mesopotamian kings would be the only people who owned animals because they would be the richest in the earliest towns. And so while the lower or the poorer people would be sacrificing grains or fruits that they gathered or whatever, just like lesser amounts, and then of the kings they would sacrifice animals because they were the only ones who owned animals. And it could have been something like that as well, where initially owning animals was a very big deal when the Vedas were written. Few people owned animals, maybe, and that kind of got into it. That if you want to make a grand sacrifice for conquering a city or whatever, you would sacrifice an animal to show you're serious about that. And maybe later, as kings got richer and richer, and even common people became herders and farmers, it was no longer such a big deal really to sacrifice an animal, except for the animal who's being sacrificed. So it may have made less sense later. I know I've known people who would, with their words, swear tooth and nail they really care about me, but they would not even make a little bit of effort to sort of understand what I kind of need from friends. So try to explain myself and then not be listened to. And then they'd make the excuse that, oh, they didn't understand, that's why they didn't. They really care. The only reason they didn't act in a way that was sort of as a wholesome friend is because they don't understand my needs, and yet they'd be unwilling to take the time to get to know me. And I think that lack of willingness to put in even a little bit of effort to get to know someone, which is a lot less than sacrificing a goat or whatever, but it can be a little frustrating to learn if you think you understand and you don't understand. For a lot of people, learning is, well, true learning often is effortful and can be frustrating. So, but if someone isn't willing to sacrifice, I think that can be a fairly decent indication that they don't really care. It's not foolproof that if someone is willing to sacrifice a goat, that therefore they do care. But yeah, someone who's completely unwilling to make sacrifices is kind of thereby signaling that whatever they're not willing to sacrifice is more important to them than the object of desire in the ritual. So if they're not willing to sacrifice time that they would be spending messing around on social media or watching just banal television shows for putting in some effort to get to know someone, then say, well, it looks like the banal TV shows and Twitter is more important to you than our friendship. Quite strong evidence. It's also not foolproof, it's the inference. So even today, I think a different notion of sacrifice can still be like a thing that's relevant, even if like I don't consult the Vedas for proper sacrifice or anything.
I think it's also worthwhile to mention the etymology of the word sacrifice. Sacrifice has the root in the word sacred, and as you mentioned, when people actually did these sacrifices, and they still do, there are still photographs of people sacrificing animals in India. So it's not ancient India thing, it's going on. They really are explicitly showing how they are performing a certain form of calculus. They are explicitly showing that there is something that they care about, that they are caring less about whatever it is they are sacrificing, so a goat or a cow or whatever. And so they do this, and they explicitly show how both things that people can care about, how they care about one more than the other. And yeah, you expose a really interesting way of navigating the world by looking at things that people do beyond what they say, as also milder forms of sacrifice, of enduring some small hardship, sacrificing their time to be with someone or to listen to someone, instead of just saying that they are friendly or that they explicitly saying through only words that they are interested, while clearly actions speak far louder than words. So I think this is a really neat way to transfer wisdom from what seems like a ritualistic, a specific religion kind of thing, to contemporary life, everyday life that is relevant to everyone. And another thing that's relevant here is I found it interesting that the Indians, they sacrificed animals and plants, but as far as I know, never sacrificed, as is found in paganistic Norse traditions, for instance, or Mayans. They seemingly never sacrificed humans, as far as I found. So that's another completely different level of sacrifice that some cultures have engaged in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I believe human sacrifice is a pretty big deal in Judaism too.
Yeah, no, I was going to sit there and say, it's sacrifice. One aspect of it is, it was an ancient social safety net. Back before you had like money for taxes and things like that, the temple and that was essentially, I'm sure a lot of the sacrifices ended up going to helping, some of the poor survive at that point in time. And one of the advantages of a society that practices, sacrifice, and again, to a certain extent, sacrifice can be seen as like savings, where you're putting the first little bit aside, is that a society that can have that principle and sustain itself is working with enough excess capacity as far as producing food, as far as the other aspects of the society, that the society is going to have some comfort zone in there. And it's it tends to be a sign of a stronger society that way. Tag out on those 2 points.
Okay, really good points. So shall we go on and look more at how the epistemology and also how the schools divided? So, okay, let's go. So most of our knowledge comes directly or indirectly from sense experience. Our senses tell us nothing about morality and ritual, however. And according to the Brahmanic tradition, the Veda is the only source of knowledge, wisdom. Their conviction was that Vedic exegesis is an inquiry into Dharma. So Dharma is the duty or whatever it is that needs to be done in terms of actions to uphold order. Also, by its very nature, Dharma applies in all places and times, and so it's universal from where they're standing. As for the Mimamsa Sutra, it arose in 2,200 to 2,400 years ago. So possibly composed by multiple authors, the original text, but it's attributed to Jaimini. And it also mentions the Vedanta school, and as mentioned, the structure of the Mimamsa Sutra is dialogical between a person who is weighing the pros and cons, a Purva Paksin, and the Siddhantin that is decisive and weighs in a considered position, and which possibly reflects probably reflects the Mimamsa Sutra position itself, or the Mimamsa school's position. And so this is a text that is considered of prior Vedas. So even they call it Purva Mimamsa, in opposition to the Vedanta school that pioneered the Badarayana, which is also considered the posterior or Uttara Mimamsa. And as to clarify, Mimamsa means inquiry into doubtful or difficult aspects of Vedic tradition. And so contrasting these two schools, so Purva Mimamsa versus Uttara Mimamsa, The first is known to us as Mimamsa. The second is known as Vedanta. Mimamsa focused on the original Vedas, while the second emphasizes Upanishads. The first one has way more sutras, way more material, and consists on difficult and obscure texts and commentary. Often more than one level of commentary is needed. Probably the multiple level of commentaries also explains the massive volume of texts. So ritual sacrifices could look like this. So they have the fire pit built somewhat like this. So one of the commentators was called Shabara, who lived several centuries after the composition of the Mimamsa Sutra. As you alluded to, Nerdalliun, another fire pit here. And so Shabara, his commentary is considered authoritative by all Mimamsikas. And here is the splits into two factions, Kumarilabhata and Prabhakara Misra. Would you want to interject? Okay.
No, go ahead.
So Jaimini operates at an abstract and general level. So he examines rules governing rituals. He even examines rules governing rules themselves. Mentions specific ritual practices, usually only as an example to illustrate his overall theory. And he has as a core subject human action, which is aligned with Paninian grammar, actually. So basically, a human, when acting, is explicitly or implicitly following rules or injunctions to guide the action. The action itself is enabled due to some desire, which is a really universal statement, as a matter of fact, transcending traditions, not just the Brahmanic tradition. Whenever we do something, we are cognizing whatever it is we are doing. We are considering, should I do it, should I not do it, or how should I do it even. And then typically we will do the action according to whatever it is we've cognized about. And often when we cognize about something, we use prior knowledge, which according to the Mimamsa school is in the form of rules. So there's a structure here of ethics as rules embedded within our mind, our metaphysics, and then the way these rules are enacted is the morality. So how we conduct our lives. And so understanding Jaimini through this commentator Shabara. So there's this concept of bhavana, which is a causal situation involving an agent who has a desire, the object or advantage that is desired, and the instrument by which it is achieved, and the procedure. So here's an example. If you want to have rice for dinner, cook the rice in a pot of boiling water. And here is the anatomy. So agent, you want rice for dinner, the desire. Procedure, so cook the rice, and the pot of boiling water is the instrument. And then Adamson and Guarneri also drew the contrast between the Bhagavad Gita and Buddhism and Jaimini's Mimamsa with this notion of desire. So the column of the left, relinquish desire, detach from outcomes of our actions, perform actions because of dharma and not because of desires. To the right, Mimamsa claims that any action presupposes desire, and desires are at the core of the participation of Vedic ritual, contingent on sacrificers' goals, the goals that are defined by the desire. And there are these two words, kodana and artha. So kodana means injunction to perform a ritual, while artha is the intended outcome of a ritual. So I've also taken the liberty here to put in dialogical form as if we were asking Shabara about the Mimamsa. So what if there is no desire for any goal? Then he replied, well, without desire, there is no pure duty to perform Vedic rites. Kodana, which is the injunction, does not apply. Another question, what about rituals that specify artha, so an intended outcome? Rather, that do not specify. This is a typo. So rituals that do not specify any desired outcome. So Shabara would reply, heaven serves as the default object of desire, for heaven is happiness, and happiness is desired by all. So sometimes in the Vedas, some rituals without any explicit intended outcome are described. And so the take of Mimamsa to interpret this Vedanta is, well, if no outcome is explicitly stated, then the outcome is heaven, and heaven equates to happiness. Then another question you already alluded to, Nerdalliun. So yes, women are can perform rituals based on the fact that they have desires, but not based on the fact that they, at least typically in ancient India, did not have any property, so they did not have any property to offer in the sacrifices. And then is ritual subordinate to human whims and projects? So the response is, what has ultimate and intrinsic value is the ritual itself. One might even say that the ritual uses the human agent rather than the other way around. The sacrificer and his desire provide the occasion for the ritual. Without human goals, no ritual would occur. The ritual exists for its own sake, which is this concept of sva-artha. Which is funny because now we know that artha means goals, and sva, which could be a pre it could be the part before dharma. Sva dharma means self dharma, unique dharma of the self, and so sva artha, it means it's the goal is self consistent. It's is for its own sake, self generated. And then what if a sacrificer dies partway throughout a ritual? I wonder what happens for them to include this explanation to this question. So if he dies partway, they even have an answer for that. His bones are placed within an antelope skin, and his posthumous puppet would then be made to carry out the remaining steps of the ceremony. Since some ceremonies involved wanting heaven, probably this was a big deal. Maybe some sacrifices were even long enough for people to die midway of these sacrifices for this to be an issue. Who knows? I'm just speculating. I don't know how long these rituals were.
There was sorry, just very briefly
Yeah,
on
go
that. I think the longest one mentioned by Peter Adamson is the year-long horse sacrifice. Is it
Yes.
a horse sacrifice?
Yeah, yeah, the horse sacrifice, exactly. That was mentioned in one of the previous slides as the upper echelon of top grade sacrifice. Yeah, maybe the king would sacrifice that to have children or to have a place in heaven or whatnot. And since it takes so long, it was possible that a king might die, and then the Brahmins probably used his puppet to complete the sacrifice or something like that. Yeah, maybe this was a big deal because people who died in these longer sacrifices were actually big deals. They were actually Kshatriyas. They were part of upper castes. And then here I have a quote by Francis Clooney, a scholar on the teachings of Hinduism, of whom we will listen to in a future episode in this series of podcasts. So he says, by seeing himself as only one element in the web of relationships, the sacrificer transcends his self-centeredness, even as he admits it, and lets it lead him to the sacrifice. He learns to play his vital part without worrying about ridding himself of the desires which integrate him into the larger whole. So it's kind of like, okay, sacrifice, desire is a thing, let's embrace it and let's channel it into social rights that actually might have some value to the sacrificer, because they have something to temper their desires and vices, perhaps even when it comes to greed or envy or something like that. While, as you guys mentioned previously, potentially goods that are offered in sacrifice to the Brahmins might even be used for the common good. Okay, so, and then there's this so question: as a revealed or revelatory text, the Veda is a Veda revealed by someone? No, Mimamsa school is adamant that it was not revealed by anyone in particular, not an author. These sages, these rishis, which could be translated as seers, were not like the Old Testament or Abrahamic prophets in general. They were more like just messengers, just kind of torch bearers relaying the torch, transmitting the authoritative Veda, which existed before them and has always existed. So as human agency is subordinated to ritual, it is also subordinated to this intrinsic value of the Veda. Just to finish, before you interject, another quote. So by Adamson and Ganeri, that ended this section. The forefathers who passed on wisdom and also reliable practices to us may have been admirable and trustworthy, but they did not invent or compose the venerable teaching. The most a human can do is to serve as a conduit from the past to the future. He is never a conduit between the divine and the rest of humanity, like the prophets of the Hebrew Bible or Muhammad in Islam. This is because no such conduit is needed. The Veda has always been here, and it's an eternal source of knowledge set down by neither God nor man. And I kind of felt this text a bit, because what I've been trying to do these last 2 years is trying to acquire wisdom from the ancient Greeks and the Arab Golden Age, the Romans, and other traditions like the Chinese, ancient China. And some of these aphorisms and pieces of wisdom, since they are repeated across several traditions, and they might have been reached by different wise persons in a kind of convergent fashion, because they really hold true regardless of the time and the culture and the geography. Perhaps they are kind of timeless, and maybe they are a shadow of something that is timeless. That I would argue not even the Veda itself is timeless. It's a shadow of whatever it is that the universe holds to be timeless. Whatever we might do or argue or investigate, the truth is embedded in the universe, so to speak. We only can do our best to find it and then relay it. And even this truth that is in the universe, perhaps it's timeless. Perhaps it's always been there. And so if we are investigating and trying to find it and relay it to others, we're kind of like doing or trying to do what Adamson and Ganeri are here describing, I would say. So guys, feel free to comment, and if needed, I can go back to any slides.
Yeah, so the last thought in my mind was just the people writing the Mimamsa commentaries, at least the Bhashya and maybe Kumarali. I'm probably saying that wrong. It was around 600, 700 CE or whatever. So for him, the earliest Vedas would have been composed about 2,000 years before he lived. So it would be nearly as ancient as texts composed. I want to say,
like Cicero, for instance.
Yeah, Cicero's texts. Yeah, so that puts it into a bit of perspective, sort of trying to be a conduit for wisdom from the past to the future. I'm not so sure if, like, for me explicitly, I don't have in my head that I'm like, well, one of my primary goals is not so much to preserve the wisdom for future generations. I feel like most of the sources that I'm using to learn the wisdom is doing a better job at that than I am. So the historians of philosophy and the historians of religion and all that, I think, are doing a much better job than anything I'm doing at sort of preserving the wisdom of the past for future generations. And I'm just kind of trying to learn it as much as I can, and to incorporate that wisdom in my life and try to live a better life thanks to that wisdom. So, to actually,
don't get me wrong. I'm primarily also doing that, but I realized after 2 years, well, since I have some of this material and it's really interesting, and I've been sharing it, maybe I'll get something worthwhile. I'll get good at it if I keep doing it. So it's more like a secondary benefit, more than a primary one, which it really is trying to teach myself as well.
Yeah, I think I'm probably capable of making summaries for others who are contemporary with me, maybe slightly younger than me, but I think that's probably the extent of my powers, to sort of teach some of the things I've learned to just a generation or two younger than me. And then they'll probably, I don't even know if that's within my power, because the generation of two younger than me are going to probably grow up in a world full of artificially intelligent tutors that it's difficult for me to imagine how much that would make a difference to education entirely. So I don't know. That's kind of getting off point about Mimamsa. Yeah, so actually the last couple of slides added some of the things I mentioned in my first salvo of comments on your slides. So I was happy about that. Not too much else to say about Mimamsa at this point, so I'll pass to Graham.
One thing I find interesting is the idea of the Veda not having an author and always being here. That seems to have a certain amount of symmetry / echo with that idea of we already know things, we just need to remember. That basically is that knowledge is already within us, we just have to remember, similar to the Veda always being here. That's the only observation I have to add at this point. Tag.
Yeah, I'm glad you added that observation. Actually reminded me of something I wanted to comment. So some of the arguments for why the Vedas are eternal mirror arguments for why language has to be eternal. So they basically argue that it's inconceivable that someone should invent language from scratch and teach it to someone else. You kind of need language to learn language, or the only way people ever learn language is by observing and participating in communities of people who use language. So they don't have this notion that over generations that can evolve. It's a similar argument that creationists use to say, well, like you need a god to invent life forms. Like, look how intricate it is. Like, that doesn't just happen randomly. But yeah, a similar argument that language can't be invented, rather than to say God invented language. They say, well, it must have been eternal then. So I don't talk about gods, the Mimamsa people, the Mimamsa tradition, except for the Vedanta, I think, talks a little bit about that. So at least the prior Mimamsa school. Not so keen on talking about the gods. But yeah, so I just wanted to mention the similarity to language being eternal. So they reckon words have always been there and language has always been there apart from any people speaking it. And similarly, the injunctions in the Vedas have always been there, because those injunctions take the form of linguistic expressions. And so similarly to language, so there's a tie-in with sort of language and linguistics and grammar and I guess the metaphysics of ritual injunction, which is a quite interesting combo. That's unfamiliar to me. I've never seen that in any other tradition, so it's a striking feature of Mimamsa. For me, at least. Maybe I'm just ignorant.
Their arguments regarding the timelessness of language also reminded me of Plato's Cratylus. So words being actually natural in how they are conceived in their structure, kind of like if a word is related to fire, then it should make a similar sound to fire or something like that. Yeah, they really seem to maintain that language is embedded in the universe since as long as the universe existed, and probably the universe always existed, according to these ideas of eternal recurrence of the universe that the Brahmanic tradition maintains. So this universe being more like a wheel. But well, that's a position, that's an argument, and we can analyze it. We will talk now more about knowledge and language anyway.
Yeah, just another point on the ontology of the universe. I can't remember if it was in the episode or if it was on the Wikipedia page. It might have been on the Wikipedia page, or it may have been in the episode, and I can't remember which of the sources about Mimamsa, but I saw the argument that one of the Mimamsa guys made that the universe didn't have an origin, and if you think it had an origin, prove it to me. If you can't prove it to me, I'm going to go ahead and assume it didn't have an origin. Like they do quite a good job of transferring burden of proof on people who have opinions different than them. It's very effective.
Well, I think in questions like these of ontology, it's really, really important to maintain as much as possible intellectual honesty and stay away from hubris and pretenses to knowledge where we don't have any functioning epistemology that we know about, that humans have ever conceived, that reliably can deliver us answers to these questions, and that can be validated and tested and confirmed by anyone anywhere. We simply don't have that luxury, and so my stance would be to say I don't know. And even though these questions might disturb some people for not having answers, definitive answers, well, deal with it. It's one of the things of life. It is there are some things for which we will never have definite absolute answers, and if we really are not capable of such a feat of answering as in an interview, a discussion, a debate involving Richard Dawkins very recently, Jessica Fraser, whom we listened to in the previous podcast, and a Christian scholar and a Jewish scholar, philosophers basically. They discussed without arriving at any question, and my conclusion is they didn't arrive at any definite answer, even though Dawkins did not stop being an atheist, and the Christian scholar did not stop being a theist. They didn't get anywhere because we don't have any epistemology that is suited to unravel whatever it is in this obscure ontology that we would need to unravel. And so we're stuck. We're stuck there, and probably will always be stuck. But having said that, next is on knowledge and language.
Yeah, good. Looking forward to some epistemology.
Okay, so they started by doing some comparative religion, which I always relish in. So the divine sent different revelations to different peoples. This is a position maintained by the Islamic religion, which is interesting that Adamson mentioned, because even a few days ago I had a Muslim guy who is from the Islamic religion also said the same thing to me. So he basically described, well, in our view, God sent different messages to different people, different prophets, and so yeah, Jews received the Torah, Christians received the Gospel, Muslims received the Quran, Hindus received the Vedas, and Buddhists received the Pali Canon, and so on and so forth. Many traditions. And well, Mimamsikas would not approve their point on the Vedas. They insist Vedas have no author, as we've mentioned. So what could be even more awesome than saying that your text came from a god is saying that being is even superior to any god that you can conceive of, and our text always existed. It's like that game of putting the hand on top of the hand. And they just and then so Vedas have this, so they have this concept of nitya, permanent, as language, as is language itself. They attempt to establish unimpeachable authority from the Veda. So and probably driven by the critics, the skeptics and the heterodox schools, the critiques that they received from them. And then since the Veda is permanent and authorless, it also cannot contain any errors. So, and this will tie in with the epistemology that we will see. And while other religious texts sent from God or gods to humanity in the figure of prophets who reveal the text to their kin. Almost always it's confined to a geography. And so let's go into Mimamsa epistemology, or rather how Mimamsikas think they know what they know, or what they say they know. So they succinctly, they are considered naturalists, empiricists, epistemologists. As Jaimini said, perception is the knowledge which one has by the senses coming in contact with something existent, which is kind of weird for us from more Abrahamic traditions. We contacted directly or indirectly with the scholastics. And the scholastics were, as I understand, not so empirical as these guys. And the scholastics, similar to these guys, were really interested in scripture. So I find it funny how two different schools that share the same kind of fervor for scripture. The scholastics were a bit more idealists and more less empiricists, and the Mimamsas were hard empiricists. They even are what I would say naive empiricists, and I think you'll see why. So sense perception can give us accurate information about things, yeah. The objects in our immediate environment are what they seem to be, according to the Mimamsikas. Since the Veda seems authoritative to them, the Veda is as such. And to remind everyone about the broad Hindu epistemology, there's this concept of pramanas, and there are 6 pramanas which are not necessarily accepted in every single philosophical school. The Mimamsas are big on the pratyaksa, which is perception or sensation, and sabda, while the other pramanas are not. They are not so. They didn't hold as important, so important as perception and scriptural testimony. Well, they also hold inference, as we have seen with the rice in the pot analogy. So anumana. So a skeptic and a Mimamsika walk into a tavern. The skeptic, so you posit that sensation is a pramana, but isn't sensation often misleading? And then the Mimamsika goes, I must insist that sensation is very rarely misleading. We can depend on it generally speaking. Goes on to explain rice in the pan reasoning and the detailed prescriptions of one ritual that can be transferred to another. Then the Mimamsika goes, sensations are innocent until proven guilty. So that's why I labeled them naive empiricists. And then after Jaimini and before Shabara, so we had this period after the supposed first founder and before Shabara, we have a period where some texts were lost, but then the original source texts were lost, but Shabara apparently commented on them. So we should consider every cognition true unless it is trumped by another cognition that overturns it. So kind of like seemingly seeing rice in a pan, and then we taste it, and it ends up being sweet, which means that it's probably tapioca and not rice. Commentators, including Shabara, would say various factors can undermine sensation. So, like the example that I gave, so if we have one sense saying something and another sense overrules it, which is a more powerful source of information, we can say that we are in the presence of what is called in more Western philosophy defeaters. And other defeaters might be a person is drunk, has drunk alcohol, and their senses are numbed or otherwise rendered less useful. So in the absence of anything that defeats a sense perception, the Mimamsikas just hold that the perception should be taken as true. So true until proven otherwise. Kumarila Bhatta, in his commentary of Shabara's Bhashya, would say sensations possess intrinsic validity, svata pramanya. And later Mimamsikas were divided on what Bhatta actually meant. So there's a minority view that states Kumarila said sensation is valid so long as it arose in a reliable way without the presence of any defeaters. And we must check if our cognitions arose in a trustworthy fashion. So adding maybe a much needed and healthy dose of skepticism, so that when they just soak in sensations, they don't just end there, and they also inquire if there are any defeaters also in the mix. While other Mimamsikas maintain that valid sensations present themselves to us as true. So I wonder what they meant with this, because it's like we see something and we just know that it's true, while we see sometimes something and we might be skeptical. Well, maybe I'm seeing a mirage because the environmental conditions are at least conducive to the appearance of mirages or something like that. Then, well, Bhatta would go to say that that cognition which is unshaken and does not conflict with cognitions occurring at other times and places is a pramana. So there's an appeal to having a certain acid test of coherence here. In normal conditions, our cognitions should be valid. The skeptic, by claiming all conditions are reliable, is wrong, according to this Mimamsika. The skeptic would go and then try to defend his position by saying, but perceptions are at least occasionally misleading. So, and then the Mimamsika would go on to say, if we demand confirmation or justification of every one of our cognitions, we will plummet into an infinite regress for each and every one of them, and nothing can be done. So analysis paralysis in all its glory. I can take a look at the rice. It seems rice, but doubt my sight. Taste it, and it tastes like rice, but doubt the accuracy of my tasting. Then invite another to taste, and then doubt their tasting too, and so on and so forth. Everything is open for skeptical challenge, as a matter of fact. But should we challenge all cognitions? And then the skeptic goes, no, Pramana is fully reliable. Maniacal laughter. And then the Mimamsa would go, there must be some kinds of foundational cognitions, since otherwise we could never be confident of knowing anything at all. And then I've added here into the mix a quote by Jamini. Words are always prior to their speakers. And so here we enter into the realm of knowledge, more knowledge than epistemology. So feel free to have a pause here and comment on anything that has been presented so far.
Yeah, I like that. I don't have too many comments about that, except maybe for the list of Brahmanas. I think you gave a general list of Brahmanas of Hindu epistemology. I sort of vaguely recall different lists given by the Mimamsa school in particular, and so there was an early list. Yeah, so that's the sixth list. I think the early list contained 4, and then a 5th was added, or it contained 3 and a 4th was added, but I forget the details. So
yeah, non-perception, I think, if I'm not mistaken, was probably added either by Nyaya or the Jains, actually, even. And scriptural testimony is probably maintained by Vedanta and Mimamsa, at least.
Yeah, so I'm also unfamiliar with the terminology, so I wouldn't be able to remember the names of the Brahmanas. I haven't really memorized any of the list, but I think probably at least 4 of those on the list, the Mimamsa school would have explicit text describing them as sources of knowledge. So even if the arguments that Peter Adamson discussed maybe focus primarily on perception and on scriptural testimony, I don't know if it's correct to say like the Mimamsa school focused entirely on that. It may have just been coverage by Peter Adamson, or it may have been the school. I don't know. Just let's see.
I added here a response by Google, sourced from Wikipedia. In Mimamsa school of Hinduism, linked to Prabaraka, consider the following pramanas as proper: Pratyaksa, perception; Anumana, inference; and Sabda. Basically what I was saying earlier. They only hold these 3 as true pramanas.
Those are the 3, and I think the comparison was one that was added by someone, but it was unclear what comparison meant. That's a quote from Adamson that I'm recording vaguely. Yeah, and you said other schools added the non-perception and the postulation. That makes sense.
Yeah, well, Upamana, Pramana, probably, let's see. So there's a sage or a scholar called Sushruta that explained this as a separate tool for learning. So the Upamana. In his Sutra Sthana. Other ancient scholars like Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Jain, Buddha included this pramana under Anumana Pramana. So they changed the name a bit, but it's still the one. Yeah, so not the Vedanta nor Mimamsa.
The observation that I would like to share is it seems like they're throwing cognition, sensation as simply a type of as simply a type of cognition as opposed to an input into it, because my take of part of what they're saying is that that sensation itself is true, but the meaning that you give to that sensation may or may not be true. That's where the contingency is. You can't question that you're having the experience. The meaning of the experience is where the questioning comes in. What do you guys think, Tag?
Yeah, so I don't think they make the distinction between sensation and perception. I think they use one term that we would most closely translate to perception, and they explain what that is when the senses come into contact with an object that exists. So whenever you perceive something, it's because your sense apparatus is in contact with something that's real. So if you perceive validity in the Vedas, it's because your senses are in contact with validity in the Vedas. And I mean, I think language existed since forever, so their metaphysics include quite abstract things existing. So you could have quite abstract perceptions be, in some metaphysical sense, in physical contact with just things that exist, even though they may be metaphysical things. So I think their ontology is maybe informing their epistemology in a way that makes it a little counterintuitive for us who operate with different ontologies, and also different ways for carving out different psychological functions.
But look at it this way. For instance, the original Super Mario game was coded in assembly language. Assembly language clearly exists before the game, before this simulation of a world, as it were, which we call Super Mario. And maybe these guys were thinking that something intangible that is much more related to information language had to exist before anything else, and this language is really powerful because it underlies stuff that seems to us to be substantial, to be tangible. Maybe this was their kind of ontology by putting language before stuff, basically.
Yeah, it could be. I'm just thinking, if I understand Adamson's presentation of the material, it sounds like in their philosophy of language, a word like cow referred to the class of cow before any human ever used the word cow. So, actually, I think the word is go.
Go, yeah.
Go, and Peterson makes the joke about the word go meaning cow in India and meaning I forget what in Japan, and being
a game.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
a very intricate game.
Strategy. Yeah, it's like similar to chess. It's a board game.
Yeah.
And in America, it's the square where you start if you want to start a Monopoly. In the Monopoly board game, the Go square.
So Americans
yes.
are greedy capitalists, while the Japanese really like to exercise their mental faculties in intricate, very challenging games. And the Indians care about cows.
The Indians care about cows. So like in some sense, the Mimamsa philosophy of language, I think, has it that the Japanese and the Americans are using the word go incorrectly. Like it's a perversion of the thing that existed before, because the true meaning of the word go, I think, for the Mimamsa school existed before any humans. So the fact that the sound go refers to a class of cows for them is prior to human use. So it seems like they would struggle to explain actually how the Japanese could use the same sound to mean something different, or how the Americans use it to mean something else. It seems plausible to me that they just weren't in contact with such a great variety of languages. The people who authored the Mimamsa school, they may have not traveled broadly and been exposed to Greek or Chinese or whatever, as maybe some of the Indian philosophers had. or maybe they just went that route to try to specifically with a motivation to give the Vedas eternal absolute authority.
Yeah, to reinforce their backing. Besides the Vedas themselves being eternal, they're also based on a perfect language, basically. So buttressing their position, basically. But if we are exposed to many different languages, even maybe we will realize this when we finally get to Mesoamerica, we might find some really interesting convergence, either and also divergence with the cognates from the Indo-European Iranian tree of languages. There are cognates that are explainable by the divergent evolution of these related languages. But there might be in some instances seemingly interesting instances of convergence as well. I'm wondering if we will find those or not. So it's just a speculation that we might start to verify later on. And yeah, they really maintain that there's such a thing as a perfect language that is embedded in the universe, even more fundamental or more essential than the stuff that we can see.
Yeah. Graham, you want to respond to some of the comments we made? Some of them were in response to your comment.
I was going to say I don't really have a whole lot to add to there, guys. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. Good analysis.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, apathy. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go. So I also wanted to add to this slide that so there's it was mentioned by Adamson and Ganeri. So yeah, if the Veda has no author, neither human nor divine, it's really interesting that they even position the possible divine authors as inferior, as being eternal. Then it is not subject to a being that would be subject of a defeater and could make a mistake. So what better way to argue that your fundamental texts are perfect than to exclude completely the possibility of error in this kind of scholastic reasoning, basically, which I find interesting, how people do these kinds of rhetorical gymnastics to reinforce their position. When traditions are under fire, they try to find ways to toughen up. So Mimamsa commentators, we should trust in sensation unless we have reason to think that the sensation came about in some kind of defective manner. We should trust in the Veda in exactly the same way, except that in this case there can be no worry that it came about in a defective manner, because it did not come about at all. Just as if you are in a position to know whether or not there is rice in the pan, to doubt the rice, we conclude that since no one is in a position to question the Vedas, there is no cognition, nor even the possibility of any cognition that could overturn Vedic authority. So, to contrast, Buddhism would state there is no enduring self. Mimamsa would say there is an enduring self. We are enduring subjects of experience. Nothing could overturn the impression that one has a self, and language itself is permanent. So very, very different from the position from the Buddhists, that besides positing no enduring self, they would also maintain impermanence being a general state of affairs, that everything is subject to impermanence. And yeah, the example of the word cow. So is it the same word or a new word each time we utter it? So are we recreating the word each time? Is it the universal when uttered isolated? Is it a specified cow when uttered in a sentence? The Mimamsa answer is a word on its own cannot refer to anything in particular. So it's not the case in this argument that the word cow stops having meaning when it's isolated. It still has meaning, but it just points at the universal. Specificity requires context. Thus, the word must be in a sentence, perhaps even accompanied by more sentence to add further context. Then we have two interpretations. So Kumarila would say theory of the connection of what has been expressed, Abhihitan via Vada, and Prabhakara, theory of expression through what has been connected, Anvi Tibidana Vada. I hope I didn't slaughter the Sanskrit language. Then Kumarila accepts that words have a general meaning when standing by themselves. So that's the meaning of Kumarila's position. And then Prabhakara teaches that words must appear within a sentence in order to have any meaning at all. So it's just this distinction of what how a word in isolation has meaning, if it has meaning, and if it has, according to Kumarila, it just points that is pointing at a universal, while Prabhakara says that it has no meaning at all and needs to be in a sentence. But certainly there are some words that function like this. Words like at. If we just say at, no one will figure out what we are aiming at with the word at, which is kind of funny. So in different phrases, in different sentences, the word at even functions differently. In contrast to when it is isolated, it really doesn't point at anything that is intelligible. So, for instance, the cow is at the sacrificial post. We will sacrifice her at sunrise. So, at being used differently. The cow looked at me with her big brown eyes was an example used by Adamson. All at once, I decided I couldn't go through with it. So, yeah, they have a point in a very concrete and particular use of words. Some of the words in isolation might have use, like cow or other nouns, while these other words with different functions, different syntactical functions, some of them really are hopeless alone. And then, so there are important types of statements in the Vedas. So there's Kodana, which is injunctions, mantras, which are really the chants that are chanted or spoken during the ritual. Statements that indicate a name. Adamson and Ganeri didn't provide a nice, neat Sanskrit technical term. They only went directly for English, and commendation of a goal to be pursued in a ritual context. So it's kind of like the Vedas commend people for having goals, for having desires, for wanting something, as opposed perhaps as being apathetic and inactive. So just like Patanjali's grammar, they kind of highlight the importance of action mediated by goals that were informed by desires. And then, well, since we've mentioned that Mimamsa epistemology draws heavily from sense perception and scripture, so sense perception informs us what is. Cognition derived from sensory input. The source tends to be non-linguistic until it is translated into language. So people acquire sensory data by seeing something. If they're seeing something for the very first time in their existence in the cosmos, probably they will be speechless. and we'll have no word for it. But if we see an everyday cow, we will probably just say that we've seen a cow. While the Vedic injunctions inform of what ought to be. So a problem that has been haunting ethicists also in more Western traditions for a very long time. So we see what is, and then how can we, by seeing what is, say what ought to be? So it's very, very difficult to convert from what is to what ought to be. People have bent their minds on this. Mimamsa comes to the rescue. They just say, look at the Vedas. They are perfect. They've always existed. And what is even better, they say what ought to be, what you ought to do, what is your dharma. So problem solved. How could sensation come into conflict with the Veda, since sensation tells us nothing about the questions that are at stake in Vedic ritual, namely questions of dharma? So they have these two pramanas. They have delineated a very neat way in which these pramanas will never come into conflict with their system of epistemology. They are differently vocated. Sense perception looks at what is, and Vedic injunctions looks at what ought to be. And so Mimamsa makes no appeal to supernatural forms of knowledge, as we've already alluded to. They reject such claims when they are made by other schools. They even go so far as to mock the Buddhists' claim that the Buddha reached a supposed supernatural form of enlightenment and can see into other worlds and supernatural beings and whatnot. This claim that the Buddha was omniscient is dismissed, utterly dismissed, as is the notion that the school of yoga can confer a special form of insight on its practitioners. So such supposed forms of cognition simply have no basis in our normal everyday experience. And so Mimamsikas reject such forms of cognition. And this is the last slide. So we did an spectacular time here regarding slides compared to previous sessions. And now, well, we can discuss to our heart's content.
I quite like the sorry, Graham, I just wanted to comment. I quite like the going through some more slides than we usually do before discussing. I think it flows a little bit better than we discussions have in the past. That's all, Graham. Sorry for interrupting you.
Oh, no worries. I was going to say they seem to be, sort of equivocating on the difference between eternal knowledge of the Vedas and the supernatural knowledge of Buddha. And again, I think Buddha would sit there and argue that he's saying eternal knowledge too. So, we're sort of a, tomato tagging on that.
Yeah, I don't know if you claim the universe has always existed, are you making a supernatural claim? So like someone who says the Big Bang Theory is wrong, like the universe has just always existed, is that a supernatural claim? I don't think that's necessarily a supernatural claim. I just think that's a tact you can take in a sort of naturalist metaphysics, or a position you can take in a naturalist metaphysics. And your naturalist metaphysics, may include a belief that so a lot of people believe the laws of nature has always existed along with the universe, or at least are as old as the universe. So if you think the universe has always existed, you might think the laws governing physics has always existed. And if you think abstract laws like that can have always existed, then you might also think that the laws governing the use of correct language might have always existed. So grammar and language and stuff may have always existed. I don't agree with that, but I don't know that that's necessarily taking a supernatural, or like substituting one kind of supernatural claim for another kind of supernatural claim. They're metaphysical positions, but natural scientists take metaphysical positions. So I don't think that that settles it as natural or supernatural. Yeah, so I think mostly a naturalistic kind of approach. There are some aspects of Buddhism that's also quite naturalistic. So the claim that the Buddha was omniscient is, I mean, it may also be interpreted in a similar way as a naturalistic claim. Just saying, well, if you meditate the right way, you will get perfect knowledge. It may just be taken as that's just the way the universe seems to work. You do meditation right, you get certain kinds of knowledge. Like if you do certain kinds of study, you achieve certain kinds of knowledge, and if you do certain kind of meditation, you get certain kind of knowledge that's perfect. So yeah, I'm just kind of thinking out loud about about what you said there, Graham, of them exchanging one kind of supernatural for another kind of supernatural.
I know what Parmenides would say. He would just say that discussing what is natural or what is not natural is a moot point, because everything is a part of the one, part of being. Even if gods or seemingly more powerful beings are there in existence, they are really part of this oneness. And so they can't be termed supernatural. So I think the term supernatural is a very, very hard word to employ, because once one thing starts to become known by us and we start to study it, it stops being supernatural, at least in the perceptions of people who might be maybe superstitious or something like that. So before, diseases were looked at with supernatural eyes, with a supernatural view by many cultures, many traditions, and then the fields of certain fields developed enough for the microbial theory of disease to emerge. And now we hardly have anything unexplainable when people become ill due to an infectious disease. And other diseases that are non-infectious, we pretty much have at least a gist of the mechanism of the disease. So no supernatural there, where before tons of supernatural.
I was going to say, you can always count on Parmenides to settle any argument.
Yeah, I like Parmenides as a kind of like a final hammer to hammer any ontology into shape.
No, for me, it's a question of something is you either have natural explanations, as Rogério was just saying, where you're appealing to what's within your understanding of nature, or you're appealing to something outside of the system. And to me, I don't see that appealing to something eternal isn't inherently, going outside of the system. And that's where I have some issues with trying to sit there and say that there's a major difference. I mean, there are differences, but that is this qualitative difference between eternal and supernatural, so to speak. Tag.
Yeah. In the interview with Eliza Freshy, and I think even in the regular podcast in the book, Peter Adamson also mentions it. It's for Western eyes, I think, at least for people influenced by Judeo-Christian religion, it's an odd juxtaposition to see a tradition that has this kind of absolute trust and faith in the authority of their sacred scriptures, along with a kind of naturalistic atheism. So it is like
it's an unusual mix. It's an unusual mix that we don't find very often in the history of philosophy and religion.
And it all rests on the interpretations of the Brahmins too. The Brahmins are accumulating.
Yeah, but so in some sense, I think the Vedas are kind of the supernatural authority in and of themselves. So the word of the Vedas are kind of a supernatural element, and then just devoid of supernatural origin, just as eternally existing. I mean, in Christian metaphysics, they do the same thing with God. They say, so God was never created, he just always existed, and he is the creator of everything. So like I guess the Mimamsa people are just like, well, the ultimate authority is the word itself, and the word itself was never created. So they don't go, the word has ultimate authority because it was created by every eternally existing God. They just say, well, no, the word is eternally existing, straight up. So they skip a step, or they miss out a step.
I also would like to call you guys to an attention to one thing that might be the case that I'm thinking about, which is there just might be not one type of metaphysics, but at least two types of metaphysics. So one metaphysics in which you are appealing to the supernatural, as you mentioned, like the Christians describing God, or the Mimamsikas describing the validity of their Vedas and how language always existed, which might be interpreted as supernatural, even though Mimamsikas try to stay empirical and natural as possible. And then there is metaphysics that we could kind of accuse scientists of engaging in, and not just scientists, which is when a scientist describes, for instance, human metabolic pathways, and it's huge, it results in a huge diagram. And the diagram is really, really useful for some people in specialized fields that are studying or doing some research on metabolism, and to say doctors as well. And so it's a kind of a metaphysics as well. So when a doctor sees someone with high blood glucose, for instance, and they actually paid attention in their biochemistry course, unlike many possible professionals that hate biochemistry and they don't pay attention. So they might, by inference at least, using their metaphysical model of how the human metabolic system works in their minds, they might actually arrive at a proper cognition of possible diagnosis just by having this metaphysical system well fleshed out in their minds, that has some relation to how things really work in the real world. And so I wonder if there's any validity to this idea that there might be two types of metaphysics.
I think they're probably at least two, and I think probably more, because the word metaphysics gets used in different ways by different people. But yeah, I do think that like scientists make use of metaphysics, at least if you use metaphysics to mean something like making foundational assumptions about the basic things that exist, and making foundational assumptions about what can be known about the basic things that exist. So really sort of doing making assumptions at first principles that you need to do science. I think all sciences do that, and I think different sciences start from different starting assumptions, and even within the same discipline, different schools of thought sometimes have different foundational assumptions. And when people are sort of either, I guess, exposing or explaining the foundational assumptions, or if they're weighing and comparing and contrasting different foundational assumptions against each other, I think when they're doing that, they're doing metaphysics. Whereas oftentimes I think scientists do science that relies on some metaphysical assumptions without maybe consciously reflecting on those metaphysical assumptions, where they're making use of metaphysics but not necessarily doing metaphysics. Just in philosophy, metaphysics usually gets divided into ontology and epistemology, and so that's kind of why I now sort of divided into foundational assumptions about the kinds of things that exist, or foundational assumptions about what we can know about those things, more or less branches up. So yeah, people doing epistemology and research methodology, if they're working at a foundational level, it would be metaphysics. I guess there's some stuff where if you have the foundational assumptions in place, you can work out details. And if you're busy working out the details, it may be less metaphysical. So a statistician just working out the details of this or the other technique, and they're not concerned with the foundational problems of induction, would be busy with research methodology perhaps, but not metaphysics necessarily. And then, yeah, metaphysics for a while in philosophy was used as a term of abuse for anyone talking nonsense, basically. So metaphysics is it's just, I think nowadays a common term for the same thing would be woo-woo, or it used to be literally used the same way people use woo-woo nowadays, although like, some people kind of call themselves woo-woo and embrace it as a thing to identify with. I don't know. But yeah, so maybe that's 3. So people, I guess, appealing to supernatural forces or supernatural authorities could be said to be doing metaphysics. So that's like one definition of metaphysics: appealing to supernatural explanations or supernatural authorities. Or you could say metaphysics is just this kind of philosophy where you're busy with foundational questions in ontology and epistemology. Or you could define metaphysics as woo-woo nonsense. So that's the third option for you. It's a question that comes up pretty regularly, like what is the nature of metaphysics in our discussions? So
yeah, and since it's such an important part of philosophy, we are regularly brushing to topics that are either really metaphysics or related to metaphysics or dependent upon metaphysics. And probably people do metaphysics in their daily lives or in their specialized fields if we use a certain definition of metaphysics. To my mind, is using mental models, basically. When people use mental models, since the mental models are a kind of a software that they have in their mind, of course, with some correlates to whatever it is that is happening physically in their brain, that stores that mental model and also engages with it while the person is engaging their sensory their senses to the real world. And so there's kind of like perhaps a dialectic between what the senses say about the real world and what the model that they have in their mind is also saying. And if there is coherence, then the person gets a sensation that they're getting it. That if, for instance, your inner model about how balls fall and trajectory of balls go, and with wind or without wind, or with curve balls or not, then you're good to be a ball catcher in either cricket or baseball, something like that. So it depends. And some of these mental models that people have in their minds might be some subconscious, like this example of catching the ball, and they cannot carry them over easily to more conscious intellectual fields like multivariate calculus, in which they are drawing on a page or on a sketchboard or whatnot equations and calculations to calculate trajectories. So these mental models, as we call metaphysics, might be even housed, so to say, in different parts of the mind, or more conscious to be used in, like this example, multivariate calculus, or subconscious to catch balls in an athletic sports. And so, yeah, if we really define metaphysics as something that is pointing at something intangible, be it supernatural or natural, and if it's natural, probably we're talking about information still housed in a physical medium. So metaphysics could be software, it could be a conscious mental model, could be an unconscious mental model, and they could be pointing towards something that exists in the real world that is physical, like a human being that has a metabolic system. And the metaphysical model that I'm talking about is a model of the human's biochemical metabolical pathways. And so there's all this variety of what metaphysics could be. And okay, yeah, this is a bit off topic anyway.
I was going to say, just to drag us a little further there, I kind of see anything that's, an extension of the natural world, the real world, as being metaphysics. It's like, in a real sense, the business world is metaphysics. They're all playing by this own set of rules that has, very little to do with the actual real world. It just it has this connection and it has effects. I find that sort of approach interesting and fascinating to take. Just going to tag out and let you guys drag us back out of the hole.
Yeah, money is quite metaphysical in nature, since there is so much non-physical, how should I say, connections working, because people are accepting the currency, accepting its value, and they are using it pretty much in a conventional way. When there's a lot of convention, probably you can be quite sure that metaphysics, you can say that we are talking about something metaphysical in nature as well.
Yeah, I think I'd be more drawn to the word artificial than metaphysical. Lots of things are artificial that I'm not so sure metaphysical, but then I'm quite influenced by the kind of work that Aristotle did in his book on metaphysics. He wrote the first book entitled Metaphysics, so I don't know, if for some reason in my mind I kind of prioritize what he described himself being up to in that book as what metaphysics is really. But yeah, people are free to use terms any way they want, and the terms, like the use of terms, evolve. I don't know that there's a great other word for people using mental models to reason. I guess it could be model-based reasoning, or model-based thinking, model-based inference, something like that. But that's clunky. You should calling that metaphysics. I don't know if it's a lot worse, although some people associate metaphysics with woo-woo, so you might sort of tinge something that's quite respectable with something that's not so respectable, or you might bring some respectability to something that doesn't really deserve all that much respectability. So other people who are doing really crazy and baseless woo-woo and maybe manipulative, deceptive woo-woo, say they're doing metaphysics, and by calling like the more useful and valuable model-based reasoning also metaphysics, you may sort of give some credibility to what otherwise maybe shouldn't. So those are some considerations, I think, for just like the use of the term metaphysics. So just back in the way Aristotle used it, he called it first philosophy, and he was really interested in establishing the starting point for all of knowledge. So in that sense, like a grand philosophical starting point, metaphysics. And I think even allowing that you could have less grand starting points for doing accounting. So you can have some kind of starting point for accounting, or some kind of starting point for biology, and a starting point for physics, and a starting point for computer science. And there'll be different starting points. But anyone sort of working on the starting point of anything, like the starting assumptions of any kind of inquiry, I think it's fair to say they're busy in some kind of metaphysics, like just doing metaphysics. They're doing something similar than Aristotle was doing in his book on metaphysics. They're not doing something necessarily that's very similar at all to people who are trying to sell all kinds of cycle salesmen, the secret knowledge, and manifesting and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know. It's up to people how they would like to to use words. I think just as regard to communication, like one of the things I like to keep in mind is that the job of a good communicator is not to say aloud the words he thinks, but to say the words he needs to say to help his audience understand what he means. And for different audiences, that may mean using different words in different ways if they understand those words in different ways.
And
So
entirely avoiding jargon in some situations.
Yeah, generally avoiding jargon as much as possible is good, unless it's specialists who have background in the same kind of jargon. Then they can make some useful use of jargon as shorthands and have much more complicated and in-depth conversations than they would have without the jargon. But yeah.
I wanted to bring the conversation back to Mimamsa and how they maintain that there is such a thing as something timelessly written in the universe, and how could we even kind of test their claim. I'm not saying necessarily that it's actually the Veda, though probably the Veda, if we study it, we might find some really interesting pieces of wisdom there that we can try out in our lives and whatnot, etc. But if our world, if our universe can be really analogized to a simulation or a video game, in which we see in video games patterns or mechanics happening repeatedly, and by looking at the repeated patterns in a video game, you can kind of infer what the code is doing or how the code is written by looking at how the responses happen. In a similar fashion, and this has been kind of brute forced also by science in the past several centuries, is we are trying to kind of make the universe cough out answers by looking at it without doing anything with it, or by doing something active with it, as by doing experiments. And so these experiments are always using the universe as a participant, whether it is in physics, whether it is chemistry, biology with cells or animals, or in sociology and anthropology with human beings. And the studies might be retrospective by looking at stuff that happened anyway, or they might be studies that are really meticulously designed and conceived, and they can even have a control group, double blind, randomized, etc. And so all this methodology is put into place so as to maximize the validity and the usefulness of the sampling that's actually possible to put together with the resources that they have. Oftentimes in studies more related to sociology and psychology, unfortunately, the study groups and the N that they use in the studies are way lower than they should be. These studies, since they are studying a subject that is so complex, human beings and human beings in organization and in groups, the low numbers are even worse. But going back to the initial point is, we are always trying to use the universe as a participant when we do science, also in a big sense when we do philosophy broadly, because even if we are in a philosophical school, or we are engaging with schools of philosophy or philosophical traditions that are not even empiricists, they will always engage with the universe, that part of the universe that is generating their minds, namely their brains. And so with enough data systematically obtained either by cognition, just cognition, by doing philosophy, or by doing something empirical, be as it may, more or less designed, more or less premeditated. We are always trying to make the universe cough up something to us that might be valuable, that might either answer a technical question that we want to answer in a specific field, or to tell us something more fundamental about the universe and even about ourselves as well, because we are also part of the universe and the universe is within us. Hence, why, besides doing empiricism, besides doing kind of formal cognition, there is also a possibility that there is another pramana, that these 6 pramanas that I've showed you are not really including, which is a pramana that is a bit more related to mysticism, which is, you have a consciousness, and if you keep your consciousness in a regular regime of operation, you will extract certain information from yourself or the universe from whatever you're doing. But if you experiment with altering your consciousness, being it through meditation or through chanting or through mantras or through, some people even use substances, which I do not condone, or dancing or whatnot, it might allow for another source of information, which, to be fair, is way more difficult to validate and corroborate. But nonetheless, it's another source of information and knowledge. So my kind of sum of this all up is, if there is something written in the universe eternally, or at least for a very long time, maybe we should wonder if we are actually using all the possible tools to kind of try to get at it.
Yeah, so I heard 2 questions there. You started with a question of how the Mimamsa claims could be tested about the eternal authority of the Vedas, or the existing, like the Vedas always existing. And the other one is, are there perhaps other pramanas, specifically these altered states of consciousness may give access to knowledge or information that otherwise wouldn't be accessed, even though I acknowledge it may be difficult to verify that. So I'll talk about the first one first. This seems more straightforward to answer. I think one could sort of reason that if it had always existed, you shouldn't see variation through time. It should stay the same through time. So if you see evidence of variation through time, and especially if you see strong evidence of evolution through time at any point in time, that would count as evidence against, maybe not proof against, but evidence against that language has existed always. And there's lots of evidence of languages evolving and writing systems evolving and customs evolving. In fact, I think the scholars who try to figure out when the Vedas were composed have plenty of evidence to say, well, different parts of the Vedas were composed at different times, and they have their research methods. I don't know those research methods. I wasn't trained in them, but it's stylistic analysis and comparing references, so cross-referencing, comparison, thematic analysis, and all kinds of methods to try to indirectly date different parts of the Vedas. And it seems to be that there was a kind of a progression. Definitely the Upanishads seem to be an evolution out of the earlier Vedas, and they definitely seem to have been composed later than the earlier Vedas. So even within the Vedas, there seems to be some evolution. So the fact that there seems to be evolution over time kind of belies the idea that they were eternal and always existed. Like there was a time before the Upanishads.
Hold on. My actual question is not whether the Vedas themselves are eternal. I kind of dismissed that because, well, they had to be written by human beings de facto, and we kind of know that human beings were not always in existence. So there wasn't always adults telling children how to speak, because before there were non-human other primates that were the genetic ancestors of what we are today. And so since just a few million years back, probably, there was absolutely no ability for any verbalization in any biology on Earth at all, even among hominids. And at some point, some verbalization appeared, because it turns out that the structures that we evolved for other things, like the tongue for the poison as a poison detector, and our teeth that became less inclined to be used for difficult to chew stuff, things just fell into position to be a voice box, basically, and due to the confluence of different components that lended themselves to be a kind of way of producing utterances, then it just emerged because of so much value that it added to human groups and human cultures. To be able to actually say, well, you shouldn't go there because there's a huge beast that's very angry, and say it really quickly to avoid the person instead of just grunting. It might even have saved lives in early phases of language, and also to transmit practices of best practices of hunting and tracking and whatnot. So language probably emerged, but probably there is some kind of source code to the universe, because as physics describes, the universe has rules that we don't know if they are eternal or not, but there seems to be something kind of making these rules possible or making these rules emerge. And probably we can never study this text, as it were, directly, that is producing all these patterns and rules and patterns from rules, but we can study it indirectly from what it produces. That's the first question. I was trying to broaden the concept that there is something written in the universe that is as old or older than the universe, and the other one is if we are to include mystical practices as premise. So basically that.
I can't help it. It's like I can sit here and I flash to Marshall Rosenbaum sitting there and saying, we have a need to head this other direction because there's this existential threat coming and it's going to be here soon. It's like, no, grunts and pointing works much better than nonverbal communication in emergencies. Tag.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on this idea that we are living in a simulation and it has a source code?
I mean, so digital physics is a thing, and I'm quite impressed by some of the arguments that Stephen Wolfram has made for computational irreducibility and trying to think of the universe as some kind of computational system that places the universe within a realm of mathematics that excludes some possibilities, but not others. So I don't know I don't think that necessarily counts as a kind of simulation, but simulation is closely linked to the notion of computation. So to consider the universe some kind of computational system is quite close to thinking of it as a simulation. It leaves open the question, like, what's the simulation running on, or like what's the base, the material or the substance for the simulation, and I don't know. That those questions are not too interesting to me because I feel hopeless to make progress on them, so I lose interest out of a sense of hopelessness. Others seem to have made progress, but like sporadically over many centuries. In terms of using mystical methods as a source of pramana, I guess that, or as pramanas, like a source of knowledge, I guess that depends on what you mean by knowledge. I think last time I mentioned the difference between episodic memory and semantic memory, where sort of knowing that a cow is a mammal and that mammals generally wean their babies, but not always. Those kinds of knowledge of facts are a kind of memory, but episodic memories are also memories. And so just any kind of experience is a source of knowledge. And I think that's actually included in the perception pramana. So I think they're the way they carve up mental functions is different than we intuitively do that. So I think whatever the one for perception was would include perceptions in altered states of consciousness. But they would add the warnings that those altered states of consciousness may themselves constitute defeaters for having a reliable knowledge. So if you fast for several weeks and then do a 3-day meditation and you start hallucinating, I think the Mimamsa school would say, like, you're hallucinating. That's good reason not to trust your perceptions. You're definitely perceiving things you otherwise would not have perceived. But because you're in this, what they would call impaired state, probably, I'm guessing, you shouldn't rely on those, on whatever you perceive then. You may perceive things that when you test it in other ways, so you may have an idea that if you go put it into practice, it works out. Just likewise, sometimes you may have a dream, and it being a dream is hallucinatory and weird and not like real world perceptions, but you're having some kind of perception. And I've had experiences where I've sort of dreamt up solutions to programming problems, or dreamt up strategies to programming problems that when I wake up and went to implement it, worked out. And there are lots of documented cases in scientific literature of people dreaming of structures of molecules, and we've spoken about this in the past. So I think if you take whatever perception you had in the altered state of consciousness, be it a dream state or be it a hallucinogenic state induced by psychoactive substance or by extreme fasting or extreme meditation or sleep deprivation, whatever it is, it's probably worth testing it out. I think it's very dangerous. I think it's very dangerous putting your faith in something like breath meditation as reliable way to come to supernatural insights. And then if you should do like an intense breathwork meditation retreat and happen to have some hallucinations because of how just some people don't even have to do breath meditation that long, they start having hallucinations. But I think it's possible to take whatever perceptions happen in those states as primary over other perceptions, and that could be very dangerous. So like a lot of other sources may be in conflict with whatever you're hallucinating, and sort of discounting all those other ways as lesser ways of knowing, and just saying, no, my mystical state of experience is a heightened state of consciousness and everything else is lesser, is very dangerous, and it can lead to people developing very dysfunctional delusions. But I'm open to the idea that people sometimes have like real insights that contain real wisdom in altered states of consciousness, whether it's substance-induced or practice-induced or just circumstance-induced, just food. Well, food poisoning would be a substance, but I mean sleep deprivation or stress or something like that can also induce altered states. And
sensory deprivation as well.
Sensory deprivation, yeah. So if something seems really insightful, I think it's worth testing it out. I think generally anything that seems useful and wise is worth testing out, but it's important to test it out thoroughly and make sure it actually works out in practice. Like taking things on faith can work out really badly, especially discounting contradictory evidence, which there's some psychology studies suggesting that it's a thing that people are very prone to, is to pay attention to anything that confirms what they would like to believe or what they already believe. And so you may have a hallucinatory experience during a meditation session, and being in a hypnagogic state find it very, I guess, I wanted to say appealing to believe, but very persuasive, like it really draws. It just makes you, like, it's compelling and it makes you believe. Because of how you're in a heightened state of suggestibility during the meditation. And then having that belief, you might actually go live your life discounting anything that disconfirms that belief, so any evidence that runs counter to that. and paying a lot of attention to anything that even remotely seems to support it. That would be an example of confirmation bias, which gets a lot more attention in, say, the realm of politics, where people really eager to pay attention to any news that would support their political ideology or their political party that they favor, and very reluctant to even pay attention or give due consideration to any evidence to show that they may be supporting the wrong party or the wrong ideology. They may be on the wrong side in some sense. But that's because a lot of the literature is American, and Americans seem to be a little preoccupied with politics as opposed to other things. I think some of the literature coming out of England, what I also would discuss that in relation to religion. Some coming out of America also obviously discuss religion. I just think I have a thing about Americans and their obsession with politics.
I think you're making a case for why it might be that people who are very engaged in mystical practices that are inside the tradition that has been doing so on a long period, a long time, like Sufi mystics, some Christian mystics, Islamic mystics, Buddhist mystics. They tend to be people that are kind of very self-disciplined. And it might be the case that they are self-disciplined and also quite skeptical as well, many of them, so that they aren't attached to a certain result. They aren't attached to a certain conclusion. And they are kind of experiencing whatever it is that the practices bring about, also yoga. And they are kind of immunizing themselves through self-discipline so that they don't crave a certain answer. And if they really have been doing their homework correctly and they get some information from whatever it is their subconscious mind, for instance, might be telling them, that might be way more creative than what their conscious mind can come up with, then within safety, always safety is number one priority. Test if these things are really useful, that they really put into practice, that they can have any value to human lives. But at least as poetry is concerned, the Sufis produce voluminous amounts of really interesting poetry, supposedly improvisation during these Sama sessions when they are in a trance, listening to music and dancing. So at least the creative part of the mind might have something going for it in mystical practices. Perhaps it might tell us something sometimes about human nature and human psychology. Some poems that I've seen from, for instance, Rumi are really interesting regarding psychology. And so, but it's probably it might be the case that most unstructured mystical practices might just give garbage into our conscious mind, and then it won't even have any usefulness. So it might be the case that only a minority of mystical sessions, so to speak, are actually useful.
I'd like to sit here and say that I think you might be tarring and feathering all Americans with a little wide of a brush, because I can speak from experience. Not all Americans are obsessed with, divisive politics, religion, and I'll throw in race and gender relations as well. Not all of them. I know it looks like that on the news, since we have dedicated news channels to each position, but that doesn't represent the entire populace.
Yeah.
And working backwards, it's I agree with you that the mystical experience is valid for personal knowledge. And that's where too many but it goes in. There's a difference between your personal knowledge and like public knowledge. It's fine for you to, to think and believe that that's true. It's when you expect others to think and believe that what you're saying is true based off of your mystical experience and not their own. That's where I see problems definitely arising. And taking one step backwards to the whole simulation question, I kind of am divided on it because I see that it's utterly undeniable the society as it exists is inherently a simulation laid over top of the natural world. I don't see how you can make a really solid argument against that idea. It's a useful simulation, it's produced some really great effects, but it's still a simulation. On the other hand, I'm not quite sure how, if you're looking at atoms and protons and that somehow being a simulation, not quite sure entirely how that works. Not ruling it out, just not saying that I at this point in time, I can't sign off on that one. I can sign off on society itself being a simulation. So, gonna tag on those points, guys.
Yeah, I'd like to apologize to the 3 Americans that I offended. I know not all Americans are obsessed with politics, but I'm just kidding. Yeah, so I think altered states of consciousness can give people real insights about other things that other people may benefit from taking seriously. So, yeah, I think I'm with Rogério that people can get insights into human nature. I think sometimes smaller than that, people can just get insights into interpersonal dynamics. So you can get insights into like creative ways to resolve tricky conflicts at work or in your family or between spouses or children or whatever. Tricky conflicts can get really tricky really quickly if there are a couple of people involved and they all care about a couple of things. Like, it gets out of hand really quickly if people have conflicting needs and constraints and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes I think dreams or hallucinations or meditation can help. Yeah, but most of the time, I agree with Rogério. Most of the time, it won't come up with anything useful. I think the same goes for academic training. Like, I think the majority of time spent in academia is filling students' heads or leading students to come up with things that aren't all that useful, like in their lives or in anyone else's lives. So I think the majority of PhD students doing studies are doing stuff that's close to worthless, if not completely worthless. And the amount of stuff that really checks out and really adds value to human culture is in a minority of things. And I think that's why it's important that there are institutional ways to check and test ideas, and those methods themselves are fallible. So it's like some good ideas never sort of get the attention that they're supposed or that they deserve to get, and some ideas get more attention than they deserve to get. So even secular, say, rational scientific academia is kind of a hit or miss kind of thing, and it's an evolving landscape over time. So just to say that, like, if most of your experiences in altered states of consciousness don't yield something useful and only a minority of things are useful, that would put it in the same ballpark as academic research. Something I've experienced is people using their experience using mystical methods as a justification for their own sense of moral authority. So they would start ordering people around and telling people what to do. And instead of giving rational reasons for, you should do this because here are the good reasons why. No, the reasons why are unspeakable mystical reasons. And the reason they know them is because they're these superior mystic practitioners that have been meditating for so many decades. And thanks to their meditation for so many decades, they know what's good for you. So you better do as I tell you because I know better than you what's good for you. And that's something that really gets on my nerve. But someone who had some insights in meditation, like, oh, last weekend I had a really wild meditation session, and I think I finally figured out how to make peace with my dad, and they want to tell me their insight, and they said, this is how I made peace with my dad. It worked out. Like, I have no problem with them teaching me something that they'd learned in meditation, or teaching me something that they'd learned during a trip on psychoactive substances. If it's, I think it's possible that sometimes people have insights that they can relate to others that will be useful to others. So I'm open to the idea that people who had spiritual experiences could teach me wisdom thanks to those spiritual experiences. But if they're just going ahead and telling me, do this, do that, and I want to know, hang on, that doesn't make any sense to me, what you're saying, do this, do that. And it's like, I've tried something similar. It worked out very poorly. I don't think I want to do that. And then they just go like, no, I'm a spiritual superior to you. You just accept my authority because I'm spiritually superior than you. That I have a problem with, definitely.
One wonders at that. How, through so many supposed, as they claim, years of self-discipline, they haven't managed to fix their shadow, as Carl Jung would say, or fix their narcissism, as Robert Greene describes so many flavors of narcissism in his Laws of Human Nature. That it's a book I really recommend anyone who has confronted narcissists, or is confronting, or is expected to confront narcissists in the future, which is practically everyone. And yeah, it's a wonder that these people who are supposedly engaged in these spiritual practices for a long time, which should bring them to humility, should burn their personality, the part of their personality that is contrived and is unessential, and it has not done so, and so they kind of function as a corrupted vessel to which this supposed wisdom is poured, and then the wisdom is rotten and spoiled, and then they just spill this poison out to other people. Basically, this is the visual metaphor that I contrived. And when we see people that are systematically spilling out poison, then you can be pretty sure, even though it's by inference, but if it's systematic, by inference, you might be pretty sure that within them they also contain only poison. And so, yeah, that's that's my take. But people who are very narcissistic and collectivist, and they want to gather people around them, and then they want to use whatever tools they have of oppressing and dominating others and instrumentalizing others. It's a wonder how resourceful they can be. They not only use material stuff like money and status in a society and whatnot, but they even use stuff that they supposedly acquire through mystical experiences. It's just, they're really, really creative. Sorry, Graham, for cutting
Oh,
off.
oh, no worries, no worries, no worries. I was going to say, just for clarification. Now, were you trying? I believe you were actually trying to say that just about everybody's going to encounter a narcissist, rather than just about everybody is a narcissist. Now,
Yeah,
I could sign off.
everyone.
I could sign off on both of those statements.
Yeah.
I think you were
Yes.
intending the first.
Yeah, but probably everyone has some narcissism. Even if you just look at infants and toddlers, they are pretty narcissistic.
Oh, yeah.
Anyone who has children knows that. Who has had children knows that we are by default narcissists and ego-centered. Kind of, it's a survival, psychological development, evolutionary psychological development kind of thing. But it can be kind of integrated, it can be kind of tamed through time. But some people have grown up from infancy to adulthood without having heard so much of a no from their caregivers or parents or whatnot, and so their narcissism is unbridled and completely savage. And it will,
I think.
yeah, and some people are even systematically raising narcissists, as you already mentioned in the past, Graham.
I was going to say, I would consider them aged, not grown up. There's
Okay.
a certain amount of difference there.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was going to say also, Nerdalliun, you're very right to avoid any of those spiritual gurus who are touting how they have meditated for, decades. You need to listen to the ones that are touting how they've meditated for at least 10 lifetimes. Those are the ones those are the ones that you need to be listening to. 10, a couple decades, that's nothing.
Yeah.
You need at least 10 lifetimes. 10 lifetimes. 100 is even better. Tag.
Okay.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I think before
if they're saying this is my 1,000th last lifetime and it's my last one, I'm not coming back ever again, then you listen to them.
yes. I think we shouldn't sign off before doing a shout out to our number one commenter who comments always very useful critiques that we are very thankful always for his critiques, even if it's kind of saying that we said something wrong or did something wrong, or that we are rubbish at reading the sutras. So this commenter called Gaurav Jha, shout out to him and thank you. He addressed us in the past session in comments. His commentary, his bhashya to us, was 3 points. The first one: your reading of sutras was terrible. It would be better if you spent little bit of time to read at least 10 sutras of Mimamsa Sutra along with Shabar Bhashya, so that you might have better grasp of how sutras texts work. Translations of these texts are available on internet archives. So we tried our best. We are no Indian philosophy scholars and much less Brahmins. We are humbled by your feedback, and we will try with the resources that we have and the time that we have at our disposal. As we've mentioned, and we've got from Peter Adamson, there are a lot of materials there to go through, and probably art is long and life is short to go through these materials in a complete and systematic manner. Then the second comment was Prabhakar and Shabara were not skeptics as shown in their quotes. They were just stating the objections one might have on their work. It is just common theme of sutra works to state lists of possible objections and then refute them one by one. So sorry for not making that clear as possible. Yes, they really were trying to engage in this systematization of critiques and how to respond to them from their own school. And then the third one is, in Indian context, knowledge is not considered statement or object as it may be considered in the West. Knowledge is a verb. So when you read knowledge in any of these texts, they actually are talking about knowledge episodes or cognition. So yeah, this is something that even came up when we were discussing how Socrates in the Greek tradition, how Socrates talked about wisdom when he was in fact talking about people, rather talking about knowledge when he was in fact talking about people having the competency to act morally, basically. So probably there is a lot of allusion to what could be termed wisdom when we are reading translations from Indian texts that translated it as knowledge. Maybe it's a good exercise to see in context if wisdom would fit better an active cognition that is a proper cognition that works better. Could be what is actually intended. So thanks Gaurav Jha for your comments, and guys feel free to add anything. And for my part, that's pretty much it.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick comment. I think that third point of Gaurav Jha about the word knowledge being a verb may help it make a bit more sense. How much closer their notion of perception is to cognition than our notion of perception. That's something Graham noted while we were talking about the Brahmanas and perception and cognition and stuff. Like, yeah, so like even knowing is like the episode of bringing it to like cognitive awareness. So in that sense, it's like you would perceive yourself as knowing in the moment, whereas you might know a bunch. Like the way in English we use the word knowledge, we might feel fine with like saying we know many things that we're not thinking about right now, but that if prompted with the correct questions, that knowledge might be elicited in ways. Whereas if you're thinking of knowledge as a verb, then that knowledge is only present when it's elicited, when it's actively being thought of. And that does make it seem intuitively closer to an act of perception than the distinction we usually make between perception and knowing. I don't know, Graham, what do you think about that?
I was going to say, I think you're hitting some good points there. It's we're wrestling with that, whole being versus becoming, knowing versus wisdom, particle versus wave kind of thing. They're both complementary aspects of the underlying reality. And that's one of the things I've noticed is he's emphasizing it as the act of cognition, sort of it's that becoming. It's an act rather than a state. And in the West, in the West, the Greeks, they were focusing on the static state rather than the underlying process that gave rise to that state, which in India is including the state. On the other one is I appreciate his comments. They help me learn a lot, and they kind of make me feel like one of the Three Stooges bumbling about in this philosophy I just kind of half think I'm grasping at, tagging out.
Yeah, it's good to have critics that are humbling us, because otherwise it's so difficult to be humble when you're perfect in every way.
Yeah.
I was going to say, my father acknowledged he wasn't perfect. He thought he was wrong once, but he made a mistake.
Anyway, yeah, I'm happy to call that a day. I think
Same.
Rogério also said same. Any last thoughts, Graham? Or you so happy to call that a day?
I'm good to call it a day. It was another great day with you guys. Looking forward to next week.
Yeah, thank you both, and thank you to our viewers, and we'll see you again next weekend.
With Vedanta, hopefully.
Hopefully with Vedanta.